There is a name that has survived exile, expulsion, forced conversion, and 2,000 years of scattering, and it may be sitting quietly in your family tree right now. For centuries, a surname was treated as a kind of inheritance. A name like Cohen, Levine, names that Jewish families carried from village to village, from continent to continent, as if the name itself were a vessel, something that could hold identity even when everything else was stripped away. The story seems simple. These names marked descent. They marked lineage. Somewhere in the deep past, the assumption went, an ancestor stood in the priesthood of ancient Israel, and that memory traveled forward through the name alone. Then geneticists opened the archive that no expulsion could burn and no forced conversion could erase, the human genome. And what they found did not simply confirm the old story. It complicated it. It deepened it. And in a few remarkable cases, it did something almost nobody expected. It appeared to verify a 3,000-year-old oral tradition using nothing but DNA. This is the story of what happened when ancient names met modern science, and why the truth turned out to be stranger, older, and more human than the simple version anyone was told. For most of modern history, Jewish surnames were treated the way most surnames are treated everywhere, as cultural artifacts, not biological ones. Historians knew that many Ashkenazi Jewish families in Central and Eastern Europe only adopted fixed surnames in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, often under government decree, from the Habsburg Empire to the Russian Pale of Settlement. A name like Goldberg or Rosenthal was frequently chosen, assigned, or adapted at that moment in history, not passed down from antiquity. But a small handful of names were different. Cohen, Kaplan, names built from the Hebrew word for priest, Cohen, and Levi, Levine, Levinsky, names tied to the ancient tribe of Levi, the tribe entrusted with the rituals of the temple. According to religious tradition, the Kohanim were not simply a class of scholars or clergy. They were a lineage, a patrilineal line said to descend from a single ancestor, Aaron, brother of Moses, stretching back more than 3,000 years. This was not vague folklore. It was a specific, testable claim that men carrying this surname today should, in theory, share a common paternal ancestor far older than almost any other identifiable lineage on Earth. For most of history, there was no way to test a claim like that. A name was a name. A tradition was a tradition. The distance between them and hard evidence was simply too wide to cross. That was the accepted picture. Stable. Reasonable. Untestable. Until a geneticist named Karl Skorecki sat in a synagogue in Toronto in the 1990s and noticed something that should not have mattered, except that it did. He watched a man who identified as a Cohen participate in a specific ritual blessing, one traditionally reserved for descendants of the priestly line. And Skorecki, trained in molecular biology, found himself asking an unusual question. If this tradition claims shared ancestry, could shared ancestry actually be detected, not in scripture, not in genealogy records, but in DNA? At the time, this was almost a fringe idea. Geneticists were not in the habit of testing 3,000-year-old religious claims. But the tool that made it possible had just become available, the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome passes from father to son almost unchanged, generation after generation, with only slow, rare mutations accumulating over time. It is, in effect, a molecular record of pure paternal lineage, the closest thing biology offers to a surname written in cells instead of ink. If the Kohanim really were a distinct patrilineal line, their Y chromosomes should show it. If the tradition was simply cultural memory with no biological reality, the DNA should look like everyone else's. Skorecki, working with geneticist Michael Hammer and colleagues, tested Jewish men who identified as Kohanim against Jewish men who did not. Across Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities, populations separated by 1,000 years of geography and history. What they found in 1997, and expanded on in later studies, startled the field. A specific cluster of Y chromosome markers, later called the Cohen modal haplotype, appeared at strikingly elevated frequency among men who identified as Kohanim across both Ashkenazi and Sephardi populations, despite those two communities having been separated for centuries. that was not supposed to happen by chance. A shared paternal signal, present across geographically and culturally divided Jewish populations, pointing toward a common ancestral male line, dated by researchers using mutation rate estimates to somewhere in the range of the biblical era, though the exact dating carries real uncertainty and should be treated as an estimate, not a fixed number. If you enjoy stories where science and ancient tradition collide in ways nobody predicted, this is a good moment to subscribe, because the deeper this investigation goes, the stranger the map becomes. Here is where the story could have simply ended in triumph. Ancient tradition, confirmed by modern genetics, case closed. But that is not what happened. Because the moment researchers looked past the Kohanim and into the wider landscape of Jewish surnames and Jewish ancestry, the picture became far more layered. Not every priestly-sounding name carried the signal. Some men named Cohen did not share the Cohen modal haplotype at all, a reminder that surnames can be adopted, inherited through conversion, changed through marriage, or assigned by clerks centuries ago with no biological link whatsoever. And some men with entirely different surnames carried the marker, likely descending from Kohanim ancestors whose family names had shifted over generations of migration and reinvention. The name, it turned out, was never a perfect record. It was a clue, sometimes an extraordinarily accurate one, sometimes a coincidence, sometimes a fragment of a much older story that had been renamed, translated, or lost entirely along the way. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal, and it pointed toward something larger than any single surname could explain: the deep, layered genetic history of Jewish populations as a whole. Because the Kohanim study was only the beginning. Once researchers had the tools to examine Y chromosome lineages and, separately, mitochondrial DNA, passed down only through mothers, they turned those same tools toward Jewish communities scattered across the globe: Ashkenazi Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, Sephardi Jews descended from Iberia, Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, and more distant, long-debated communities such as the Bene Israel of India, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, and the Lemba people of southern Africa, who had long maintained oral traditions of Israelite descent despite living for centuries among entirely different ethnic and religious neighbors. The paternal and maternal evidence did not always agree, and that disagreement turned out to be one of the most important discoveries in the entire field. Studies of the Y chromosome across Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi populations repeatedly pointed toward a shared Middle Eastern paternal ancestry, consistent with communities that trace their origin to the ancient Levant before dispersing across the Mediterranean and beyond. But when researchers, including geneticist Doron Behar and colleagues, examined mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, the picture shifted. Rather than tracing back primarily to the Middle East, a large proportion of Ashkenazi maternal lineages appeared to converge on a strikingly small number of founding female lines, with research suggesting several of these lineages may trace to Europe itself rather than the Levant, likely entering the population through conversion or intermarriage in the early centuries of Jewish settlement in Europe. In other words, the fathers largely from the Near East, the mothers in significant part, apparently local. A population's ancestry split down two different lines, each telling a different chapter of the same longer migration. That is not a flaw in the data. That is the fingerprint of history itself, of communities that formed not through a single clean migration, but through movement, contact, conversion, and centuries of small, human decisions that no map could ever fully capture. There are, broadly, three explanatory frameworks that researchers have used to make sense of this layered picture, and it is worth holding all three in mind rather than collapsing them into one simple answer. The first is direct descent, populations and lineages that trace an unbroken paternal or maternal line back toward the ancient Levant, largely preserved through strict practices of endogamy, meaning marriage within the community, which is unusually well documented among Jewish populations across many centuries and regions. The second is admixture at the founding moment, the idea that as Jewish communities formed in new regions, particularly in the early diaspora across the Mediterranean and Europe, a relatively small number of migrants, disproportionately male according to the Y chromosome data, incorporated local women through marriage or conversion, creating founding maternal lineages that were geographically local but became genetically Jewish from that point forward. The third is convergent tradition. Cases like the Lemba of southern Africa, a Bantu-speaking people with an oral tradition of Israelite ancestry that outside observers dismissed for generations as folklore, until a 2000 study led by geneticist Tudor Parfit and colleagues found the Cohen modal haplotype present at meaningful frequency specifically within the Lemba clan that oral tradition identified as their priestly line, a genetic echo of a story that had survived for centuries with no written record at all, carried instead through memory, ritual, and name. None of these three frameworks cancels out the others. Together, they describe something closer to the truth than any single origin story could, a history built from multiple streams, converging and diverging across thousands of years. The landmark moment that reshaped how researchers understood all of this arrived not from a single surname study, but from a much larger genome-wide analysis. In the years following the early Y chromosome work, researchers including Harry Osterer, Gil Atzman, and international collaborators moved beyond single markers and began comparing hundreds of thousands of points across the entire genome, across Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and neighboring Middle Eastern and European populations at once. The scale mattered. A handful of genetic markers can create a misleading illusion of closeness or distance. A genome-wide comparison, drawing on far larger datasets, offered something closer to a true composite picture. What it revealed was striking in its clarity. Jewish populations from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, despite centuries of separation, different surrounding languages, and different surrounding gene pools, showed strong genetic affinity to one another and to a shared Middle Eastern ancestral source, more closely connected to each other than to their non-Jewish geographic neighbors in many cases, while still carrying detectable regional admixture reflecting centuries of local life. In Europe, North Africa, or Central Asia, the old story had assumed dispersal meant dilution, that 2,000 years of scattering across the world would eventually erase any shared signal entirely. The genome-wide data suggested something different, that a common ancestral thread had persisted, not despite the diaspora, but woven through it. The twist researchers had not fully expected. Not that Jewish communities carried Middle Eastern ancestry, many had assumed that already, based on history and tradition. The surprise was how strongly that shared signal endured across communities separated by 1,000 years and thousands of miles, while simultaneously carrying visible, honest evidence of everywhere those communities had lived along the way. Not a single bloodline preserved in isolation. A living record of contact, movement, and return, carried forward in the genome the way an old manuscript carries the fingerprints of everyone who once turned its pages. Picture the terraced hill country outside Jerusalem, where Levite families are believed to have once served, generation folding into generation, under a sky that has not changed even as everything human beneath it has. Picture the narrow streets of a Rhineland town centuries later, where a family took the surname Cohen not knowing whether it was memory or aspiration, and picture that same name, still spoken today, at a synagogue thousands of miles away, on a continent no ancient priest could have imagined. Somewhere between those two images sits the honest answer to what a name like that actually means. Not proof, not certainty, but a thread, sometimes intact, sometimes frayed, sometimes reattached generations later by pure coincidence, reaching back into a past too old and too complicated for any single story to fully hold. This is why the science here demands humility rather than certainty. A shared surname is not a guarantee of ancient priestly descent. A matching genetic marker is not a courtroom verdict. What the data offers instead is something more honest: probability, pattern, and the accumulated weight of evidence pointing toward a plausible, well-supported history, while leaving room for the countless individual stories that don't fit the pattern at all, and are no less real for it. That, in the end, is what DNA has done to the story of Jewish surnames. It has not handed anyone a simple certificate of ancient lineage. It has done something more valuable. It has shown that a tradition carried for 3,000 years through ritual, memory, and a shared name was not simply folklore. In at least one remarkable case, it left a measurable trace in the human genome itself, echoing across communities that had not spoken to one another in centuries. And it has shown, just as clearly, that the full picture is layered. Fathers from one direction, mothers sometimes from another, communities formed not by purity but by contact, conversion, resilience, and return. Perhaps that is the more honest inheritance. Not a single unbroken line stretching back to antiquity, untouched by history. Something more human than that. A story of survival written not only in the pages that were kept, but in the cells that were passed on quietly through everyone who carried a name forward without ever knowing exactly what it held. If this kind of story, where ancient memory and modern genetics meet in the same sentence, is the kind of history you want more of, let me know in the comments which name, people, or population the evidence should uncover next.